Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS. Thank you all for listening, and thanks especially to those of you who have taken a moment sometime this week to recommend the show to a friend, colleague, enemy, passerby, or public stranger. How do we, what's the term for the people that we address in our social media lives but not in our daily lives? Like a digital acquaintance? I'm grateful to you for recommending the show to anybody in whatever form, because that is really the way the word gets around. Thanks also to everybody who subscribes to The Secret Show. If you go to sleerickets.substack.com, you can put in your email address and I will give you a week's access to the feed for free. What is that week's access? That is 80-ish, I think 80 now, episodes that have already gone up of additional weird shit. Additional weird SLEERICKETS shit of all varieties, and a new one every week. I've heard from Matt Wall actually wrote, this is an endorsement or a condemnation depending on your perspective, but he wrote to say he thought we'd had a few really good ones in a row recently, so I was glad to hear that. I also will recommend to you, if you don't already subscribe to Poetry Says Alice's podcast, the most recent episode of that I think is really extraordinary. It is not about poetry, as she addresses in her introduction, but it is, I think, an example of, or maybe it's a counterexample of I was just writing to Zara about this the other day. I don't, generally speaking, consider podcasting to be art. Certainly not what I do here. But what Alice does on Poetry Says sometimes is art. And I think the most recent episode is a very strong example of that. It's called Antarctica, though it is not about Antarctica, except briefly and figuratively. So do go check that out. That's Poetry Says. It's a good show in general, but particularly check out the most recent episode. I was going to say especially if you're a woman or a parent, but then also but it's equally true if you're a non-parent or a man or whatever you are. It's worth a listen. I like the idea of me saying, telling women what they especially should women, I have some special insight for you. I thought I would pass this along just to, let you know what I think would be good for you to listen to. Again, it's it's another counter recommendation. I'm going to get a note from Alice saying, "Thanks, Darls, but maybe next time skip the endorsement." Oh, I am going to be, at Fergie's Pub in Philadelphia, March 13th, giving a reading with Aria D. Matthews, I'm not sure, Aria D. Matthews, and Timothy Donnelly at Ernie Hilbert's E-Verse Equinox reading series. Oh, and I have a book. Thank you to those of you who've read it, who've written me very kind notes about it. I am going to be giving some readings and some talks having to do with it coming up. And if you would like me to give a talk or a reading, here is what I can say. There are very few things that I am reliably good at. My lovely friend Helena threw a little thing for me with JP and Jonathan were there. It was just a sweet little book party thing at a bar in Durham, and she brought a gorgeous cake, and then she very foolishly handed me the knife to cut it, and I just to the immediate, it was immediately clear on the faces of JP, Jonathan, and Helena that I was very, very bad at cutting a cake into slices. And it just sort of got worse as it went along until Helena, sweetheart that she is, just finally said, "You really are not good at this, are you?" So if you want me to cut a cake, don't. Your wish is mistaken. If you want me to perform reliably at a normal job in a responsible way, talking to my sister, who's a very demanding boss, I'm generally speaking a terrible employee. I am a middling husband and father. I maybe break even on being a friend. Certainly as a son or brother, you know, not the best. God, what am I good at? Is teaching. I'm pretty good at teaching, but not terrific. And some people really hate me as a teacher. Here is one thing I can say. I give good readings. If you would like me to come to your institution, audio, educational, academic, business, religious, if you would like me to come give a reading or a talk of some kind at your institution, boy, I'm good at that. I do a good job at that. It's a small thing to be good at. It's a very narrow thing, but that I can do. I will even try not to use profanity if you ask me, and I might succeed most of the time. So that's something I'm going to be doing some of on some podcasts and at some schools and at some places, and I would be happy to do more. Just let me know. You can reach me at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com. All right. I got this really great article from Coleman. He sent it in with a characteristically Colemanian quip. The subject line is Stalin, voracious reader, not a very good person. Just read this article, made me think of the various conversations you've had about whether reading literature tends to make readers into better people. Hope you're well and congratulations. Oh, he's saying nice things because he's a nice man. So let's get to this main essay, though, because I think it is worth a look. So the title of this essay, it ran in Unheard. It was written by Boyd Tonkin, and it's called The Empathy of Joseph Stalin. And the subtitle or the deck is Nothing is More Dangerous Than a Well-Read Dictator. So it's in part a review of this book called Stalin's Library by Jeffrey Roberts that came out somewhat recently. So this essay is from February 21st, 2022. So if this were poetry, we would consider it very new. Very new article by Boyd Tonkin. But Stalin's Library, this book talks about literally Stalin's Library, his collection of books. And what Tonkin starts by saying that when Stalin died, he had 72 unreturned volumes from the Lenin Library in Moscow on his packed shelves. His library in total included 25,000 books and was spread across, various offices and houses and dachas and so forth. The marginalia, the underlining, the enthusiastic involvement of Stalin in various literary decisions and contests all suggest that he was, in fact, a brilliant, passionate reader. He was, whatever else you want to say about Stalin, he was extremely intelligent. He was extremely well read, and he loved books and loved them in a thoughtful way, and even had opinions about them that suggest that he was a really sensitive and subtle reader. So this is from Roberts calls him a highly active, engaged, and methodical reader. So he claimed that he read 500 pages a day. And in the 20s, sorry, some of this is a little blurred. In the 20s, in the 1920s, he ordered 500 new titles every year. Not to mention the piles of works submitted to him by hopeful or fearful authors. This is more from Tonkin. He annotated with passion and vigor. Hundreds of volumes crawl with his distinctive markings and marginalia, their pages festooned with emphatic interjections, ha ha, gibberish, rubbish, fool, scumbag, and, more rarely, agreed, spot on, or the non-committal doubt conveyed by the Russian, da, which reminds me a little bit of the Australian, yeah, nah, da. Which is sort of sinister in this case. He was apparently also a very skillful editor. Tonkin and Roberts say that he was not an original thinker, but he was extremely good at cutting down clotted or verbose writing to its essence. Really, he he believed in clarity, in concision, and he even was notorious for cutting out hero worship from his own biographies. So when there was official writing on him, he cut out anything that he thought was sycophantic or was worshipful. He was interested in clear, compelling characters, and he was even insistent that Soviet villains, villains of the class struggle, former kings and emperors and nobles, be viewed as individuals and not merely as representatives of their class. So he was really he was a literary reader. Here's a section. This is a good excerpt. This is from Tonkin. Of all the mind-scrambling glimpses of the despot as an emotionally intelligent and feeling intellectual gathered in Stalin's library, this is the Roberts book, none quite matches the record of a Central Committee meeting held in September 1940 about the limits of artistic expression. The General Secretary spoke up firmly on the side of freedom. You have to let people express themselves, Comrade Stalin argued. Artists should avoid fairy tales that toe the party line. Take the wonderful Chekhov, who has Stalin is quoted as saying, he has no heroes, but rather gray people. Stalin approves of this, Tonkin says. Even the enemies of the Soviet Union should not be depicted as monsters lacking all human traits. Even Trotsky, here you imagine Leon Trotsky. Here you imagine stifled intakes of breath around a smoky Kremlin chamber, was a capable person who must be shown with all of his positive qualities. Was a capable person. Just a couple of weeks earlier, Ramon Mercader had, on Stalin's orders, buried an ice axe in Trotsky's skull in Mexico City. So it's an interesting piece. He goes on at some length and makes a few distinctions and speculations. I'm not totally convinced by all of his speculation, but it is the claim basically is that it is dangerous to suggest that merely reading, and even reading well, reading thoughtfully and with feeling and with understanding, even that is not a reliable way to make someone a better person. And the specific claim here, he's citing a couple of papers. One is in 2009, one is in 2016. 2009 is specific. He says a widely cited Canadian paper claims specifically engaging with narrative fiction and mentally simulating the social experiences represented may improve or maintain social skills, especially skills of empathy and social understanding. And then the 2016 survey of the study of previous studies says, quote, readers of fiction score higher on measures of empathy and theory of mind, the ability to think about others' thoughts and feelings, than non-readers, even after controlling for age, gender, intelligence, and personality factors, end quote. So the claim basically in these studies, and a claim like frequently made by humanities, by defenders of the humanities, is that reading increases empathy and empathy makes you a better person. And Tonkin's claim here is that whether or not reading increases empathy, it may be true, actually, that reading and empathy to some extent go hand in hand. But empathy and good behavior do not. So he claims that Stalin was not a psychopath. I think Roberts is the one who makes that claim, and Tonkin affirms it. But there does seem to be a distinction, and this is one that's actually made that is gone into in some depth in the comments to this article, which, like most comment sections, end up going a little far afield, but actually have some meat and some specific citations in them. But the claim is basically that Stalin could not have been a psychopath because he experienced empathy. But there is a distinction between two kinds of empathy. And this is what sent me back to some writing Paul Bloom did about 10 years ago. He had a 2014 essay in the Boston Review called Against Empathy, which is the name of a book that came out shortly after that. He cites in it Leslie Jameson's book from shortly earlier than that called The Empathy Exams. And both in both that book and in the article, he makes a kind of a case against emotional empathy. That is, though there's some dispute about this, there are sort of two different species of empathy that get articulated by psychologists, and sometimes by psychiatrists. So Simon Baron-Cohen, who presumably couldn't not be the brother or something of Sacha Baron Cohen. They have to be related, I assume. Both Brits. They're both named Baron-Cohen. They both seem to be about the same age. So Simon Baron-Cohen is an expert on autism, and specifically on high-functioning autism, what used to be called Asperger's, or Asperger's syndrome. And he and others do make this distinction between, sometimes it's called warm empathy and cold empathy, or emotional empathy and cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy is the ability to imagine other minds. What's sometimes, in children called theory of mind. I remember reading when kids start to lie, that's actually a good sign for their moral development, because it means that they are imagining that someone else has a different interior experience than they do. When a baby hasn't quite yet developed object permanence, early on, they sort of assume that whatever they're thinking and feeling, you have knowledge of, or you're at least on the hook for. Whereas as they get older, they start to understand that other people have other distinct internal experiences, that other people's minds are not the same as my mind. And so it's only once you understand that distinction that lying makes any sense at all. So that's why lying is seen by child psychologists to be a positive development, initially at least. That is theory of mind. That is the ability to form some speculation about what other people are thinking. This is cognitive empathy, right? The ability to sort of do the math of someone else's mind, whereas emotional empathy is the actual experience of someone else's emotions, right? Or what you perceive to be someone else's emotions. And these are often smeared together, I think, unproductively. Paul Bloom and Leslie Jamison, actually, I have not read her book, but he cites her at a little bit of length, basically disparage warm empathy or emotional empathy, saying that it leads to personal burnout, right? Feeling other people's feelings all the time is exhausting. And it's just another source of bias. It just makes you more likely to care about and feel for people that you can relate to. And it makes you less likely to care about people you have more distance from, or who are harder to relate to, or maybe who are less attractive to you, or more sort of superficially different from you. So that emotional empathy, the experts seem to agree, was a bad thing, whereas cognitive empathy, the ability to sort of to process other people's thoughts, to conceive of, to construct a simulation of other people's minds in your own, that was a good thing. Boyd Tonkin's claim, though, is basically that was what Stalin was great at. And as Simon Baron-Cohen and plenty of other people have pointed out, psychopaths, conventionally understood, at least successful psychopaths, tend to have a pretty sophisticated theory of mind, pretty sophisticated cognitive empathy, but they lack emotional empathy. Paul Bloom argues that there's actually that's only sort of one of many things psychopaths are lacking, and so warm empathy, emotional empathy is not in itself the magic bullet for making you be a good person, but it is. Here he says, the problems that arise have to do with emotional empathy, feeling another's pain. This leads to what psychologists call empathetic distress. We can contrast this with non-empathetic compassion, a more distanced love and kindness and concern for others. Such compassion is a psychological plus. Putting aside the obvious point that some degree of caring for others is morally right, kindness and altruism are associated with all sorts of positive physical and psychological outcomes, including a boost in both short-term mood and long-term happiness. If you want to get happy, helping others is an excellent way to do so. Hard to argue with that, and hard to argue that compassion, with his claim that compassion is a good thing, But the 2009 and 2016 studies that Tonkin cites and Bloom's argument more obliquely do seem to make a case that cognitive empathy, cold empathy, unfeeling empathy is really the better tool. And emotional empathy really just sort of gets in the way and causes bias, causes your feelings to put a thumb on the scale. Stalin, however, does seem to have had a very sophisticated sense of cognitive empathy. He was very good at imagining other minds. There is a funny little anecdote that is not from Stalin's library, but that Tonkin cites, and I wondered at it a little bit. It actually made me think about something I've observed among poets in my own life. So this is, of course, the case of Osip Mandelstam, who was one of many intellectuals who was persecuted under Stalin. Mandelstam wrote a couple of pieces about Stalin. The Kremlin Mountaineer is the one cited here. He also, if memory serves, I think it was Cameron who said something. He wrote a short piece about comparing, maybe it was in the Kremlin Mountaineer, but he compared Stalin's mustache to a cockroach, and that apparently was very offensive. I mean, understandably, that is pretty offensive. But he was imprisoned, and his wife was murdered, I believe, or effectively murdered. Oh no, wait, maybe I'm thinking of who was there was a playwright who did the same thing too. Maeterlinck? Was it Maeterlinck? Meyerholt. Who was Meyerholt? I don't remember. He killed a lot of people. He killed a lot of people. So this is anecdote that Tonkin relates that gave me a pause in a kind of a funny way. One of the best known incidents, he says, not mentioned in Robert's book, concerns the arrest and persecution of the poet Osip Mandelstam. In 1934, Stalin phoned the detained poet's friend, Boris Pasternak. Mandelstam's case is being analyzed, Stalin reassures Pasternak. Everything will be worked out. Why haven't the writers' organizations come to me? If I were a poet and my friend had fallen into disgrace, I would climb the walls to help him. Right? Which I find that part to be kind of touching. Basically saying, like, where's your loyalty? Like, one of your colleagues, like a fellow poet, is up Schitt's Creek, and like I'm not hearing any protest from any other poets. Like nobody is coming to me. Now, in fairness, like it's not like those other poets would have had good reason to expect much fair treatment from Stalin if they had come forward on Mandelstam's behalf. But I kind of appreciate Stalin's like calling the poets out, saying like, where's your loyalty? Where are your balls? Like, this is your friend. If he were my friend, I would break him out of prison. Then this is the part that really gave me pause. Then Stalin dons his critic's hat to ask, but is he or is he not a master? Pasternak replies, that's not the point, and requests a meeting, but Stalin hangs up. So I think Tonkin's point is twofold. One, that Stalin was a serious reader. He was not some Philistine. He was a serious, thoughtful reader who cared a lot about literature. And he was a monster and a brutal dictator and a mass murderer. And he even, tortured and murdered plenty of artists and poets. But I find this last little exchange sort of intriguing, because like one reason Stalin might hang up is that Pasternak requested a meeting, right? And like he wasn't going to grant a meeting, and so he wasn't interested in that part of the conversation. But I can imagine another reason he might hang up is that Pasternak said whether or not Mandelstam is a master is not the point. And to Stalin, it's exactly the point. He really cares about that. But I also find it fascinating that is a question he asks. Because while I know lots of poets who love to argue about whether this poet or that poet is better than another poet, or whether so-and-so is major or minor, I don't know if I can imagine, I don't know that I can recall ever hearing a poet turn to another and say, is this person a master or merely a talented practitioner? That there's something about that question that feels amiss to me. I think it may be in part that it suggests something schoolboyish. It suggests that Stalin wants to know, he wants someone else to tell him how to rank his writers. And that to me suggests that maybe his reading here was actually lacking. Because if you read a poet's work and you are thoughtful, here's a question that might make sense. A question that might make sense is, why is this person not better recognized? Another question that might make sense is, why is this person so celebrated? What is it that other people experience when they read this person's work? What am I failing to acknowledge in his work? But is the work which I do read and acknowledge and appreciate, does it count as major? Is it masterly or not? That to me suggests that this is a case in which he's not actually reading very well. And I don't know, I want to be very careful about this because, Jonathan's perennial argument is that it is basically a fool's errand to try to make any general statement about what poetry is or what poets are like, because you will always, always, always find an exception. And that's, I think, a true argument. And so I won't make a claim about what poetry is or, what essential traits poets have, because there are surely exceptions to any such claim. But in thinking about the distinction between cognitive empathy and emotional empathy, it does make me wonder a little bit about the lyric, at least insofar as lyric poetry into the modern age has followed, or at least drawn from, the ancient tradition, writing short works of verse, often in the first person, the primary function of which is to evoke an emotion, to convey a powerful feeling from the writer to the reader. Now, if you have a robust sense of cognitive empathy, I can imagine drama and long-form fiction would be of great value to you. And if you have an ear for music, I can imagine that the verse craft, to use Elijah's term, the verse craft of lyric poetry would be of interest to you. But if you lack emotional empathy, warm empathy, that the useless, bad kind of empathy that Paul Bloom hates and Leslie Jameson poo-poos, and Stalin apparently was lacking, if you lack that, then it does begin to seem a little harder to imagine that lyric poetry would have much interest for you beyond technique. And so that is a case in which I could imagine being a little bewildered, particularly if you are a very smart and thoughtful reader with a lot of experience. You're very well read. You're probably better read than any of your state censors and scholars who are working for you. And yet when you read a poem, you think, well, this is clearly skillful. This is clearly well stitched. I may actually do a little episode. I read through the most recent issue of 32 poems, and there was some good, there was some not great, but there was a lot to think about. And one of the things that stood out was just that line by line, phrase by phrase, it was hand stitched, right? The poems, the words were put together without recourse to cliche. There's in tailoring, or whatever you call it, in suit making, there's a distinction between fused and hand-stitched suits. So the lapels of a men's suit, it's a flat piece of cloth. It's two pieces of cloth laid together. It's flat. It has a little bit of stiffness to it, depending on the kind of cloth you use. And in almost all suits that you would buy off the rack, for, even expensive suits, even like, you buy a suit for $1,000 today, and probably at least parts of this suit are going to be fused, which is to say, glued. The fabric will be glued together in at least portions of it, whereas a very high-end suit will be hand-stitched. There will be no glue used. All of the panels will be hand-stitched together, and that allows it to lie more comfortably and naturally on the body. It allows it to move in a less stiff way. It's just nicer. And even if the overall fabric isn't very pretty, and even if the cut is not particularly flattering, it is simply a higher quality piece of clothing than a fused suit is. And that's what I thought reading 32 poems. I thought even the poems I don't like, they're hand-stitched. There's no fusing going on. And so, that's something I think you can appreciate if you simply have a not even necessarily a well-trained eye, just an eye that has gotten used to reading a lot of poetry. You recognize when lines, when phrases, when sentences have been pieced together bit by bit, manually on purpose, rather than sort of having big slabs of language tossed in ready-made. So I can imagine having an appreciation for the music. I can imagine having an appreciation for the construction of the suit, for the piecing together of the language. But if you lack emotional empathy, then I'm not sure. I'm not sure how effective a lyric poem is going to be. And it did lead me to think about something I have noticed in my exchanges with other poets. Not all poets, but a lot of them. So Bloom cites he cites Simon Baron-Cohen talking about Asperger's as well as about psychopathy, and Baron-Cohen is a big proponent of empathy in all forms. He thinks it's simply a good thing. But in the same article, Bloom refers offhand to a consistent scientific observation that people with Asperger's syndrome are low in cognitive empathy, which I have heard consistently, but that they're also low in emotional empathy. And that I'm not sure I've heard as consistently. I would have thought that was not the case. Maybe so. I don't know. It doesn't especially matter to me. I'm neither giving nor receiving diagnoses along these lines, but something I will say about a lot of the poets I have spoken to, written to, corresponded with, gotten to know, not all of them. And in fact, Jonathan is a strong counterexample to this claim, but a lot of them, I say greater than, there's an overrepresentation among poets I've known of people with low cognitive empathy and high emotional empathy. That is, they tend to do two different things frequently. One, they give offense without meaning to, and give offense while shocked that they could be giving offense. They say things that come off as callous or insulting without meaning to at all. And generally, when they learn that they've done so, they are horrified and feel terrible about it. That is, that they were not very good at doing the math of somebody else's internal experience. But when informed of someone else's internal experience, they are stricken. They feel it deeply. And then on the other hand, they also tend to imagine that they have given offense when they have done nothing at all to give offense, and agonize over it. So I have just found, in corresponding a lot with a lot of different poets over the last few years in particular, I mean my whole adult life, but especially in the last few years, that I am constantly writing notes apologizing for things that it turns out didn't bother anybody, or only catching on late in the game that I said something inadvertently deeply hurtful. And I'm constantly getting notes from people that either say something really callous, which then, the writer is really horrified to learn was hurtful later, or I'm constantly getting apologetic notes from poets who are horrified that they have so offended me, when of course in no way did they offend me at all, or even I didn't even register that an occasion for offense had occurred. So again, Jonathan is, generally speaking, high in cognitive empathy, and I think maybe a good balanced level of emotional, he has some emotional empathy, but maybe he's not crippled by it. He certainly seems to have a lot of compassion and a lot of fellow feeling and an ability to think about the needs of others and act to take care of them. He's a very caring person, but he's not an emotional diabetic the way I am, the way a lot of other poets seem to be. He seems to have things, when it comes to other people's feelings and other people's experiences, he seems to be a little more in control of things. He seems to have a better handle on what's going on. So it is not the case. I'm certainly not saying that to be a poet is to have a combination of high emotional empathy and low cognitive empathy. I'm just saying that there are a lot of poets like that I know, and also I am like that. And it does make me wonder if you could really either truly appreciate lyric poetry or write much of it if you did not experience emotional empathy. That it may be that it's, generally speaking, not particularly good for public morality. It's not a great trait in politicians, whereas cognitive empathy certainly is. It may be that Leslie Jameson and Paul Bloom, both of whom point out that doctors often do better when they have a lot of cognitive empathy but not a ton of emotional empathy. And maybe that they're entirely right. But it does seem to me that if nothing else, emotional empathy might be useful when it comes to making art, or at least certain kinds of art. And lyric poetry might be sort of well within that subcategory. And, I think a little bit about if having low cognitive empathy means being a little bit at sea, being a little bit, alone on an island, where you're not very good at reading other people, you're not very good at conveying your own emotions to other people, you feel a little bit unable to contact, especially intuitively unable to make contact with other people's minds. If having low cognitive empathy is being alone on an island, having low cognitive empathy and high emotional empathy is like being alone on an island that is on fire. And it just seems to me that there may be something about that combination that it doesn't, I don't think it necessarily makes you any better at writing or reading lyric poetry, but I could see how it might make lyric poetry more attractive, because it is, in its essence, a way to link one island to the next. It's a way to link one person's internal experience to another's by way of words, without having to rely on all of those pesky nonverbal cues. Oh, but so reading the Stalin piece, I thought of a few different literary corollaries. Is that the word I'm reaching for? Yeah, that's not quite what I mean. A few literary parallels, maybe? Touchstones? I don't know. I'm not sure what I'm saying. But I thought of a few things. So one was Henry V. So when I was probably 10, maybe, I saw the 1989 film adaptation of Henry V, adapted and directed by, and starring Kenneth Branagh. That was, I believe, based in part on a production that he starred in, directed by Adrian Noble, at the RSC, the Royal Shakespeare Company, in a few years earlier. So one source says 1985-ish. But there's a specific innovation in that I believe it was originated in that Adrian Noble production in 1985, which is memorably included in the 1989 film version. So I am actually weirdly a fan of both major film adaptations of Henry V, both the 1989 version, which is, if you're like a 10-year-old boy, it is in outside of Brooklyn, where boys and girls and 40-year-old women and men are all identical. If you're like a normal 10-year-old boy, it's basically the coolest thing you could ever see. It's lots of action. It's lots of like guys getting mad, and then their madness giving them sort of like strategic and military superpowers. It's very cool and fun and boyish. The 1944 adaptation by Laurence Olivier, starring and directed by him, is so different. It is not as fun if you are a 10-year-old boy. It is pretty cool if you are a nerdy adult. It includes a really wonderful, vivid reenactment of like what staging of Shakespeare was actually sort of like in the Globe Playhouse. Like it is the very beginning is a pretty realistic reenactment of the performance of Henry V in the Globe at the time, using the methods used at the time. But then it shifts from there into a kind of a semi-realistic vision. The whole thing has a kind of a dreamlike quality to it. So it kind of shifts between realities, and they're kind of like the I think also a 1989 Tim Burton Batman used some like visibly rippling backdrops of cityscapes in the as the backdrop of the movie. And Olivier certainly does that with some of the landscapes which are borrowed from, or at least sort of modified from the what was his name? The French Duke who painted the book The Very Rich Hours, with those famous landscapes. And I think he is actually a character cited in the play, or at least in the Olivier version, if not in the original, I can't remember. But it's a good, weird, surreal, just like the production value is really cool and strange. But the Branagh version, I think, is probably more emotionally immediate, and certainly to my 10-year-old boyish heart was more gripping. The innovation introduced in the Noble adaptation that Branagh held on to is that Bardolph, who's one of Prince Hal's drinking buddies from back at the bar with Falstaff, who does not appear in Henry V. Bardolph's one of his old drinking buddies, and he also goes to France on the military campaign that Henry leads as king. But Bardolph is arrested for stealing. So in conquering France, Henry issues a decree saying that there will be no plunder, that as the English soldiers march through France, they will not loot any of the French villages they pass through. In part because he's sort of trying to make the point that he is reclaiming this is his France, this belongs to him, and so you don't loot your own people. It also is a way of enforcing a kind of discipline in the ranks and a sense of shared ethos, and a lot of the spirit that he invokes in inspiring his men to fight with him is that they are all going to act like nobles. They're all going to elevate their natures, and so part of that means that we're all on the hook for behaving well, for behaving nobly. And so Bardolph is arrested for stealing. He steals, I think, a silver or pewter coffee pot or teapot, something like that. And in the original play, all of this happens off stage, and Henry, he was Hal in the previous play when he was the young man getting drunk with his friends in the bar, but now he's King Henry, and he gave an order that anyone caught stealing should be hanged. And in the original play, all this happens off stage, but there's a kind of a mention of it on stage. And he's, that his own decree has caught up one of his old friends. But what Noble did, the director, is he brought all of that on stage. And so instead of just referring to this happening, they bring Bardolph on stage, still alive. And they give effectively, I don't think there's a line. It's all done with, with a nod or a gesture. But effectively, Hal is given a chance to countermand his own order. They know that it's his friend, and so they bring him forward, and they say, well, here he is. Like, he was caught stealing, and the sentence for that is death. But we're bringing him here in front of you implicitly because, of course, you are the king, and you could just say, not this guy. Let him go. And Henry doesn't. He gives the order, and they hang him right there in front of him. And then it also makes for a nice scene, at least in the film version. I don't know how this worked in the stage version, but when the French messenger arrives with a message from the French, an English soldier has just been hanged and is just swinging there when he comes up to address the king. And so it does convey a little bit of the sense of okay, who am I dealing with now? But that example came to mind because it did seem in a funny way consistent with this Stalinist vision of cognitive empathy that is not overwhelmed by emotional empathy. You understand how other people's minds work, and you understand how this is going to play. The same way that he knows he's insulted by the gift of tennis balls at the beginning of the play, but it's not just that he's insulted. Even if he didn't feel anything, he understands that it is an insult from the Dauphin. And so he can't let it go. He has to respond in such a way as to let the Dauphin know that he can't treat Henry this way. Henry does have cognitive empathy. He is pretty good at gaming out how other people are thinking. He's very good at doing this when he woos the French princess. And his speech to her is pretty effective. He says, what is it? It's pretty charming. He basically says, I'm not attractive, but I have the kind of sturdy bad looks that only get better with age. And so basically, if you have me, if you'll have me at my worst, I think is the line, and I'll only get better over time. But he is good at understanding other people. He's good at working them. He's good at, Machiavelli would approve of him, not because Machiavelli wanted princes to be cruel, but because he wanted them to be savvy. And Henry is very savvy, but he is able when he needs to. We're told this does also happen offstage. We're told he entirely snubs Falstaff. He just passes him cold and cuts him dead, and as my grandmother would have said. And with Bardolph, he literally gives the nod to have him hanged. He won't be swayed by feeling in the moment. He won't be swayed by an emotional connection to someone else, by the upswell of feeling in his breast at the suffering of another. But he is very good at imagining how other people are thinking about all of this. And in this way, it made me think about what might make, I think it is one thing if you imagine your dictator to be a mere brute, right? A mere barbarian. And then it's yet another thing if he is just a calculating mastermind. If he's brilliant, and even if he's educated, but he has no concern for humanity at all. If he just has an icy cold mind that is all calculation and doesn't care at all about the human experience. But that probably makes you a less effective dictator. It probably makes you a little bit less. It makes it a little harder to hang on to power, right? That in fact, having some ability to think deeply, not just about cold, hard facts, but about the human internal experience, makes you better at ruling whether or not you give a shit about other people. And again, I think Bloom makes a good case that neither form of empathy is finally a very good measure of moral value that in itself, that really there is another thing, which is like bothering to care about other people and being capable of restraining your own impulses. That those things maybe matter more when it comes to measuring someone's moral worth than merely the ways in which he is able to mirror internally the experiences of others. But it does seem like if you want to be a really effective tyrant, you probably are better served by having some cognitive empathy. I thought also of the Sorrow Acre, a story that we taught in grad school. We taught our undergrads in the course that we all taught at Hopkins. And I think everybody hated that story except me. I love it. It is Joanna said it's about an acre of reading. It is sort of long and dense and slow, but I find it to be really rich. It's a story that takes place in Denmark. It's by Isak Dinesen, who is that's the pen name of Karen Blixen. Is that her name? Is that her real name? Yeah, Karen Blixen. Isak Dinesen is her pen name, but it's a story about it takes place in, is it the early modern period? When does it take place exactly? It's still the feudal era. And so it takes place on this estate, and that's been in this powerful family's possession for many generations. And the last scion of the family, his own natural son died. And so it appears that his nephew might become the heir to the property, and his nephew has come to visit. It turns out that things are a little more complicated than that, but you get this sort of confrontation between the uncle, the old world master, and Adam, the new, young, sensitive guy who was educated in England and is much more of a sensitive humanitarian or humanist, and the old uncle is of another era. But the question of the day is this Sorrow Acre. So a boy who, a feudal servant on the estate, a peasant, was charged with theft, and the case is unclear. There's no proof in either direction. There's just an accusation of theft. It may be that it's a motivated accusation. It's not clear, but it is an accusation. And he claims he didn't do it. They claim he did. The punishment for this is to be sent to a prison, which is more or less to have your life destroyed under these circumstances. He would be sent away to do hard labor somewhere, and his family would never see him again. In this case, his family is all that's left of his family is his elderly mother, Anne Marie. And so if this boy is sent away, Anne Marie will effectively never see him again, and he will probably die in prison. So she begs for clemency. She begs for mercy. And the uncle, the lord of the estate, says, well, it would be petty of me simply to make a decision because there's no proof either way. So how about this? How about if you, Anne Marie, a single older woman, can mow an entire acre of wheat in one day between sun up and sundown, then your son will consider your son innocent. And this task, we're told, is a task that would normally take one man, 3 days, or 3 men 1 day. And these are, good, strong men in the prime of their life. And so it is effectively impossible for her to do this. But she gives it all of her best. And so over the course of the day, she is making her slow progress across this acre as other peasants are starting to gather and watch her. And the uncle feels honor-bound to stay there all day and watch the entire progress. He has his meals brought to him there, and his nephew visits him there. And there he has this discussion with his nephew while he's watching this woman work herself to death, ultimately. She does finally mow the entire acre, and it kills her. She drops dead at the end of finishing the task, and her son is freed. But he has this intellectual discussion with his son about the gods. And the son, he's gotten really into Nordic mythology. And he says, the gods of our Danish forefathers are as much more divine than they being the Greek and Roman gods, as the druid is nobler than the augur. For the fair god, and the druid being a soothsayer, a priest of the Celts, and an augur being a soothsayer priest of the Romans, I believe. Yeah, that's right. He says, for the fair gods of Asgard is the semi-paradisiacal realm of the Norse gods. For the fair gods of Asgard did possess the sublime human virtues. They were righteous, trustworthy, benevolent, and even, within a barbaric age, chivalrous. And the uncle's sort of devastating response to this is, it was a great deal easier to the northern gods than to those of Greece to be, as you will have it, righteous and benevolent. To my mind, it even reveals a weakness in the souls of our ancient Danes that they should consent to adore such divinities. It was easier for them to be righteous, and it is a weakness of our ancestors that they worshipped these moral gods. Now, I think you can make some arguments about exactly how moral the gods of Asgard are. They do seem to have a little bit more concern with honor than the Greek gods did. But I'm not sure it's so clear cut. But Adam is he questions. He says, well, why? What do you mean it was easier for them? And the uncle says simply, they were not as powerful. He says, nay, power is in itself the supreme virtue. But the gods of which you speak were never all powerful. They had at all times by their side those darker powers which they named the Jotuns, the adversaries, the evil gods, and who worked the suffering, the disasters, the ruin of our world. They might safely give themselves up to temperance and kindness. The omnipotent gods have no such facilitation. With their omnipotence, they take over the woe of the universe. He goes on essentially to say, when we take over control of our people, of our peasants, of our workers, we have to act like gods, which means both that we can't show too much petty individual human mercy to them, but also that we have to honor that it is part of their lot. Just as the gods, they never really experienced real loss or suffering. In part, when Ares gets stabbed in the crotch by Diomedes in the Iliad, and he comes crying to the Olympians and they all laugh at him, it's in part because they're cruel, but it's also in part because his suffering is not real. Right? His injury is not injury to him in the way that it would be to a human. And so to mortals belongs the nobility of tragic loss. whereas to the gods, everything is finally comic. And the uncle says basically, well, we as lords of the manor have to accept that's our role. To us, everything is light, everything is comic. It is to our peasants. They are the ones who are in possession of real tragedy, of real sorrow, real loss. Denison is setting aside, old notions of tragedy as being simply, a downfall concerning a nobleman. He says, and here on earth too, we who stand in lieu of the gods have emancipated ourselves from the tyranny of necessity, should leave to our vassals their monopoly of tragedy, and for ourselves accept the comic with grace. Only a boorish and cruel master, a parvenu, in fact. Parvenu, I believe, means a newcomer. Oh, well, basically, someone who's just arrived, but also seems to have a suggestion of like the political equivalent of new money. Somebody who's come to power recently and without, maybe somewhat illegitimately. Only a boorish and cruel master, a parvenu, in fact, will make a jest of his servants' necessity or force the comic upon them. Only a timid and pedantic ruler, a petit-maitre, a little master, will fear the ludicrous on his own behalf. Indeed, the very same fatality which, in striking the burgher or peasant, will become tragedy, with the aristocrat is exalted to the comic. By the grace and wit of our acceptance hereof, our aristocracy is known. So there is, in his vision, actually something sort of crucial to his role in not being overly moved by the individual suffering of his servants. That for him, there are greater concerns. This is, again, he's freed himself from the tyranny of necessity. These are liberal nobles, the liberal men. They are free men. They're men who can devote their lives to the liberal arts. And so it might be of much greater concern whether or not someone, whether or not a poet should be classified as a master. That might be of more concern than whether or not he is to survive the winter. So yeah, I thought of this figure when I was thinking about what does it mean for somebody to be so mercilessly tyrannical while also being so sensitive to the human condition and so perceptive and thoughtful. I mean, that's I think part of what really blew me away about this piece on Stalin was that he was immensely thoughtful and very aware and much more perceptive than a lot of his advisors were. He was a very good reader, apparently, though I do retain maybe my skepticism about his readings of lyric poetry. I'll close with a poem, a recent poem, came out of Shane's most recent book of poetry, The Many Hundreds of the Cent. Weird book. Weird book. It's got some really good poems in it. It's got some poems I didn't love. It's just got some long, strange stuff. It's got a long sequence on Helen at Troy. He's got a couple poems about Helen. One is, several pages long, and it's sort of like more than several pages long, and it's got a lot of weird action sequence. It's just a strange book. And then this poem was maybe the one that stuck with me most. It's called Penelope and the Watching Fire, and it starts as basically a classical myth retelling poem, what Quincy Lair snidely referred to as the canon poem, and I'm going to be doing an episode with Jonathan about Lucille Clifton, and there is an essay by a critic that he sent over that in that essay, the guy refers to this kind of poem as an academic poem, academic poetry. And this starts as that sort of poem, but then that's not quite all it's doing. This is Penelope and the Watching Fire by Shane McCrae. So it takes up the story of Penelope, the wife of Odysseus, who believes herself to be, or at least is believed to be, his widow for many years when he does not come home from the Trojan War, and she is beset with suitors who all want to inherit Odysseus' wealth and power, and she puts them off by claiming that she needs to finish weaving a funeral shroud. Is that what it is? Is it funeral shroud? Is it burial shroud? Oh, it's a burial shroud for Laertes. That's right. And Laertes is still alive at the end of the story. I had forgotten that. Okay, so this is Wikipedia at least saying that it's the burial shroud, a burial shroud for Laertes, the famous thief who was Odysseus' father. And Laertes is still alive at the very end of the Odyssey, which is like a real strange closing scene. It's always made me kind of curious about. It makes me kind of want to write something. The way that the poem ends in a way weirder way than I'd remembered. So she's putting them all off by saying, "Oh, I've got to finish weaving the shroud, and when I'm finished with it, then I will choose one of you to marry." But of course, she weaves all day, and then at night she undoes all of her work so that she has to start over, and she never makes any progress on it. And that way, she never finishes it. In Shane's version, he modifies this claim slightly. It's a slightly different version of this unmaking that she performs. Penelope and the Watching Fire. This is by Shane McCrae from The Many Hundreds of the Cent. She burned the loom each night for heat, but each morning it returned whole, and draped with a restless blue fabric, a wave's skeleton. The first few mornings it appeared, she was surprised by the wave. She had publicly vowed she would not lay eyes upon the sea until her husband, who even as she spoke her vow, perhaps lay drowned in the sea, returned. So she'd vowed that she would not look at the sea until Odysseus came back. And when this shroud is when this tapestry is appears on the rematerialized loom, it's a wave. It's the thing she has vowed not to look at. She had publicly vowed she would not lay eyes upon the sea until her husband, who even as she spoke her vow, perhaps lay drowned in the sea, returned. And soon she came to believe the wave was sent to her by the god of waves to torment her. It's Poseidon who tormented Odysseus so much. Maybe this is another curse from him. One of her suitors, an attractive man, but too young, had told her, as her husband's slaves cleared breakfast from the room, of the blinding of the Cyclops by no man, who, she was sure, was her husband. Of course, it was her husband who used the name No Man to taunt Polyphemus. Perhaps the bones with which she wove were his. Perhaps she would not see him again, but instead would labor always, her fingers bloodying the blue threads at the machine of her husband's bones, and so she thought of him, long years into his absence, as his slaves stuffed the loom, its hollow parts, the gaps in its workings, with straw, as she watched them bend, who could not choose how to use their strength. So there, Shane does something that I have sort of long wanted to see done well in literature. So I think, when we go back into historical settings in literature or in movies today, when we go back to eras in which there were great injustices, our tendency is to hang a lantern on them, right? It is very difficult to go back to certain periods in a movie or a book today without making an acknowledgement of what we know now, of the way we look now on those eras, even if at the time, for most people who were not themselves being victimized, something like, say, slavery might not have been the headline, right? Might have been something that sort of happened in the background. And it's just not something we do very well in historical fiction today, because it is always going to be the headline for us. And so we can't not draw a lot of attention to it, whether we're drawing attention merely to the pure injustice of it, or we are creating, often a slightly anachronistic character who feels compelled to speak out about this injustice in a way that, might be a little unlikely coming from most people at that time. It's just difficult for us to recapture the, in retrospect, chilling nonchalance with which most people probably didn't really bother to pay attention to what we now see as terrible injustices, what we now correctly see as terrible injustices. It's just difficult for us not to also call a lot of attention to that when we tell those stories today. What Shane has done, though, I think pretty cleverly, is he's taken up a setting in which slavery was very much present, right? A mythological, version of ancient Greece, of ancient Greece, pre-literate ancient Greece, but one in which we are used to thinking about lots of things other than the existence of slavery. Slavery is not the headline when we think about mythological ancient Greece. Gods are, heroes are, wars are, love, all these famous stories are. So he's chosen that setting, and he is halfway through the poem subtly dropped in a note about the slaves as her husband's slaves cleared breakfast from the room. And then he's come back to those at the very end. This sort of background action that we have sort of shoved off into our peripheral vision while looking at the main event, which is Penelope and her sad long-distance love affair with her crooked-minded husband. And then at the very end, those slaves become the foreground, become the main event in a way that is startling and I think really moving. We've been thinking, of course, about Penelope's plight, and rightly. I mean, she has a sort of this strange situation. In Shane's rendering, it's not just a politically tenuous situation, it's a metaphysically confusing one, right? It may be that this loom, we don't know what's happening with this loom. She burns it every night and it reappears in the morning. And this wave is on it, taunting her with the possibility of her husband's death. But then her plight is actually the far lesser instance of suffering in this case. Even though her husband is absent and possibly dead, these human beings are still his slaves. They still belong to him, and they are doing the work she gives them. She tells them what to do. We're told at the beginning, she burned the loom each night for heat. Of course, what that means is she gave the orders for it to be burned. And it's his slaves who stuffed it with straw. And I think it's a moving articulation of their condition, because he doesn't just say they were oppressed, they had shackles put on them, they were punished, they were forced to do things. The way he puts it is that they could not choose how to use their strength. They had power. They possessed something. They had been born with something of value. And it wasn't up to them how they used it. So I'll read it one more time. I just think it's a strange poem that sort of takes this fascinating left turn to a different main event. And we never really see the resolution of Penelope's story. I mean, it's also, I think, clever because it's a smart choice of subject matter, because it's not going to bother us that we don't get to see the resolution of it, because we know the resolution of it, right? It's an old story. One of the advantages that the Greeks had in telling all these old stories was that it was okay if they didn't get to the whole ending of the main event because we already know that story. We are here to see this particular slice of it. And it just so happens that in looking at this particular slice of the old story, it turns out that there's something else in the room. I'll read it one more time. I think I have a couple of temptations, right? One temptation is to say, oh, well, if you want a neat and tidy explanation for what this miracle is, why the thing is coming back to her every night and why it's got this wave taunting her, maybe that's the intervention of these slaves. Maybe that's the slave's revenge on her. Which seems, that's certainly the Occam's razor explanation, right? But there's also something, by my lights, stranger and sadder and in a way more familiar. If in this world there is not just nobility and injustice, but there's actually also the presence of gods and magic. That there's not just injustice at this human order, there's also this larger cosmic inequality. That the gods are bothering to taunt a noblewoman with her husband's possible demise while their slaves keep being slaves. Like that goes on happening without intervention. To me, it feels much truer in a way to the ancient Greek world and to our world, like Auden's Icarus, or Bruegel's Icarus, falling into the ocean in the background, while other more important things are happening. Right, and this is, I guess, an example of that. The Penelope is the noble figure who slides into the background while we are left looking at the farmer plowing his field and the torturer's horse and the dog with its doggy life and these silent, strong, unfree slaves enslaved by the noble woman we've come to love and care about, and her absent husband, who's broken her heart. All right, this is Penelope in the Watching Fire by Shane McRae. She burned the loom each night for heat, but each morning it returned whole, and draped with a restless blue fabric, a wave's skeleton. The first few mornings it appeared she was surprised by the wave. She had publicly vowed she would not lay eyes upon the sea until her husband, who even as she spoke her vow, perhaps lay drowned in the sea, returned. And soon she came to believe the wave was sent to her by the god of waves to torment her. One of her suitors, an attractive man, but too young, had told her, as her husband's slaves cleared breakfast from the room, of the blinding of the Cyclops by no man, who she was sure was her husband. Perhaps the bones with which she wove were his. Perhaps she would not see him again, but instead would labor always, her fingers bloodying the blue threads, at the machine of her husband's bones. And so she thought of him, long years into his absence, as his slaves stuffed the loom, its hollow parts, the gaps in its workings, with straw, as she watched them bend, who could not choose how to use their strength. I do like that note. One of her suitors, an attractive man but too young, had told her as her husband's slave cleared breakfast from the room of the blinding of the Cyclops by no man. The slaves clearing breakfast are inserted as a kind of a parenthetical there, and the point of this statement, the point of this whole sentence, is that the suitor is telling her about no man blinding the Cyclops, and she senses that this is Odysseus. But it's just such a human observation, even when it's inappropriate to do so. Which, you could argue it's not that inappropriate for her to be thinking about suitors at this point, when Odysseus seems pretty fucking dead. Stallings has a great poem also about Penelope called the Wife of the Man of Many Wiles. And how she, whether or not she remained quite that faithful over all those years is perhaps a matter of opinion. But I love that in this moment when there's so much else to think about, Penelope does like the totally human thing and like sizes the guy up. He comes up to her to tell her this story, and she looks at him. She doesn't give him the time of day. She doesn't encourage him at all. She just but she does internally, form an opinion. He's an attractive man, but too young. It just feels very true to life. This is a little different maybe than the Stalin example or the Sorrowacre example, because it's not her slaves' minds that she's concerning herself with, but yeah, there's something about that intersection of vulnerable, sensitive human experience with the bluntness of absolute power that brought this poem to mind. All right, I will stop there. I won't try to form an absolute thesis. Just a lot of interesting stuff to think about. And yeah, maybe I do have a kind of not a thesis, don't worry, not a claim, not a theory, Jonathan. It's okay. Don't get I was gonna say don't get worked up, but Jonathan doesn't really get worked up. He's a pretty level-headed guy. But yeah, maybe there's something there. Maybe there's something there. And also, like, let's all just go a little easier on one another. Like, let's stop. Like, we're all going to inadvertently offend one another, but maybe let's stop freaking out about having offended one another and just try to let each other. Let's just. I don't know. I don't have a solution. This is why we have poems, because because we don't know how to be people. So that's all right. That's already too absolute a claim. But Elijah, before you leap in and say that this is more romanticism, don't think I was not thinking of you when I said I know a lot of poets who have high emotional empathy and low cognitive empathy. You are included in that. You are a member of the club. Welcome, Elijah. We are happy to have you. As are a lot of you. Like a lot of people I've corresponded with because of this show. Fall into this strange imbalance. And this may mean that you would be terrible dictators, you would be questionable doctors, you would be maybe bad people. And certainly, Paul Bloom and Leslie Jameson would disapprove of you. But at least it gives you a reason to like lyric poetry. Maybe you're like, at least, I don't know. It may not make us any better at it, but it makes it matter more, perhaps. All right. Enough of that. Thank you for listening. You can reach me as always at sleerickets@gmail.com. Do come see me in Philly, March 13th at Fergie's Pub. I think that's all for now. I'm going to edit this down. It's going to be fucking long as shit. All right. With any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.